time 2,000 years before Christ, almost 2,000 years before Christ, which is almost as long as the period now. It's almost been as long now since the time of Christ. So that long ago, we see a conflict between these two men. The people I'm talking about, of course, are the Pharaoh of Egypt and Moses. And in Exodus chapter 11, what we see there is a standoff between these two powerful men. And what we see there in Exodus 11 is we really see the culmination of many different things, as well as a foreshadowing of things to come. We see many comparisons, or we can see many comparisons between that time period and now, as well as throughout history. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is recorded for us in the Bible, so that we could draw comparisons, but also see the work of God, as well as the nature of humanity represented in these two figures. So what we see in Exodus chapter 11 is we see these two leaders. Chapter 11 is really just the when it comes to a head. There's actually the pretext, and we're all familiar with the events leading up to this. Even the world is, to one degree or another, because of popular media throughout the decades. There are movies like Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments, and so many, even in the secular world, have an understanding of kind of these events, at least in a superficial manner. But what we see in Exodus 11 really does depend on the chapters prior to that, but we're not going to go into that this morning. Instead, what we're going to look at firstly is we're going to read this chapter in its entirety. It's not that long a chapter. We'll be looking at other verses as well to really see the comparison of these two figures of Pharaoh and Moses, as well as the work of God throughout. And if you look at this time period, and if you look at this nation of Egypt, there's a lot of parallels there, as I said earlier, with the time period that we're living in now, as well as our own nation, the United States of America, the nation that we're living in. And so just to give brief context of that, we see at that time, 1800 BC, around then, we're not sure of the exact date, and we're not sure of the exact identity of this Pharaoh, but I'll talk in a minute about the person who we think it is. But what we do know about that time period is Egypt is a very powerful nation. Historically, we know it was considered one of the most, if not the most, powerful nations in the ancient world, at least for the longest time period. There were other nations that rivaled Egypt's power, or certainly there were nations that expanded their empires in a much larger area than Egypt. But Egypt, even going by common popular history, has had the longest period of rule or empireship of any nation, really. Maybe you could contend that China had empires that spanned as long as a period, or dynasties that ruled as long or longer. But certainly in the ancient world, in the Near East, Egypt is unparalleled, even compared to its contemporaries like Babylon, which also are known for having long histories and having great power. But Egypt is often the nation that, or the empire that historians will go back to, because it's the birth of many different beliefs, and it was the Egyptians that the Greeks and then later the Romans looked to and copied, emulated. And so a lot of the gods and practices and knowledge of Egypt got passed down. Even the profession of physicians, doctors, they had their origin in ancient Egypt. It was really the Egyptians who passed that knowledge on to the Greeks, and then the Greeks to the Romans. And yes, there are other nations whose knowledge was accumulated along the way, including Arabs and Chinese and other cultures. But really, that lineage can be derived from the ancient Egyptians. So we have Egypt at that time. Right now, if you go to ancient Egypt, if you go to modern Egypt, you see the ruins of ancient Egypt with the pyramids, but and the Great Sphinx and many other ruins of temples and monuments and many things. But those really don't convey the splendor or the riches or the majesty of Egypt or the power of Egypt at that time. A lot of things got eroded away by the sand, literally the sands of time, as the sands strip away the paint and the edifices of many structures. And so you have to look at virtual reconstructions or see the modern archaeology, how they reconstruct what Egypt must have looked in its heyday. And really it's comparable. Obviously we're standing on the shoulders of giants today. Our technology and knowledge and all these things were built on many millennia of advances. But if you place yourself back in that time period and imagine what Egypt must have looked like, you can imagine it being comparable to any major power of the world today, much like the U.S. is. And so in that context, we'll be looking at Exodus chapter 11 and seeing the head of this, or the final dialogue that occurs in this conflict. If someone could please read the entirety of Exodus chapter 11.
The Lord said unto Moses, "It will I bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward he will let you go again. When he shall let you go, he shall surely thrust you out and you together. Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow of his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, jewels and silvers and jewels of gold." And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. And Moses said, "Thus said the Lord, about midnight will I go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and upon all the firstborns of the beast. And there shall be a great cry throughout the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it any more. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or beast, that ye may know how that the Lord put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these thy servants shall come down unto me, and bow down themselves unto me, saying, Get thee out, and all the people that follow thee, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. And the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. And Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, so that he would not let the children of Israel go out of his land.
Thank you. So we know from the prior chapters of Exodus that this is not the first encounter between Pharaoh and Moses. And just as an aside, Pharaoh was, the word Pharaoh is derived from an Egyptian word, and it wasn't the proper name, but rather a title for the leader of Egypt. And so what that word actually means is great house. And that was the term used to refer to the actual literal palace of the Egyptians, of the king of Egypt. And so the Pharaoh, that word Pharaoh, great house, just was one way of referring to the king. It's the same way today that we might say the White House said something or the White House issued a release. It's the literal white building in Washington, D.C. doesn't do any of those things, right? We know that it's just a shorthand for talking about the administration of the White House. and the administration of the White House is doing the will or speaking on behalf. One would hope most of the time speaking on behalf of the president. And so in the same way, Great House used to just become shorthand. It was one of many titles or a shortening of one of the many titles of the king of Egypt. And so this was the Pharaoh. This Pharaoh here is just referred to as Pharaoh, but that's really just a title and shorthand for his position. So what we see here is the Pharaoh and Moses. They have this encounter. This is a culmination of the events prior. We know that this is the final plague that is about to take place if Pharaoh doesn't listen. And we know at the end of this chapter we read that God had to tell Moses that no, he's not going to listen to you. So this 10th plague is about to go through. But the 9 prior plagues, and each one was not quite linear in increasing in intensity, but each of these plagues that occurred, these 9 earlier plagues that God brought upon Egypt, because the Pharaoh wouldn't let them go worship, wouldn't let the Jews worship their God. Each of those plagues, by the end of it, it's worsening in intensity, because we see the final one prior to the 10th plague was one of darkness, and one that was a complete and total darkness over the land. And so these other plagues were also terrible as well, but we saw that God was judging Egypt progressively, giving them a chance each time, and each time Pharaoh hardened his heart and wouldn't let the people go. And so God was judging also each of the gods as well of Egypt, and systematically showing that none of these had gods of Egypt had any real power. So one thing we're going to really take note, one of the main points of my message is to really show the comparison between these two figures of Moses and Pharaoh, or the Pharaoh. And so what we're firstly going to be looking at Moses, and we're going to see really who Moses is that led him to this point, to this verbal duel, as it were, with Pharaoh. One thing we see about Moses firstly is from this chapter itself. As we read in verse 3, it says in verse 3 that moreover, the second part of that verse, moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. So it's kind of interesting to note there that Moses was actually he was well regarded or esteemed as an individual. So it says that he was great in the sight of the people, which is kind of interesting to note, because later on, even his own people don't actually give him the due respect a lot of the time, and rebellion, and it's a cause of consternation for Moses later on, as we know. But it's what it does say there, and we see in this chapter that Moses was recognized by the people of Egypt themselves, even though the Pharaoh himself was stubborn, and this conflict occurred. The people of Egypt themselves, they were willing to give up for the Jewish people the silver and gold, and to acquiesce to the Jewish people leaving the nation, even though the Pharaoh wasn't. So that's the first thing we really know about Moses, was that he was a great man and seen as a great man, even by the people of Egypt, even if he wasn't recognized by the Pharaoh as such, or in many ways, even his own people. But even though Moses was a great man, we know that his beginnings were rather humble. We saw, or we know in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, I'll read it just to save time. Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 11. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities Pithom and Ramses. So we see, and we know the events that occurred there, that this escalation of oppression of the people of Israel. Prior to that, when Joseph and his descendants settled in Egypt and multiplied, there was a time period where they enjoyed at least some amount of freedom, even though they were there was some separation because they were living in the land of Goshen, and they continued to live in the land of Goshen up until their exodus. But we don't know all the details of their interactions with the Egyptians, but there was at this point, and this probably occurred at least in part due to what happened earlier, and this isn't recorded directly in the Bible, but this is something that we know from history, that there were another Semitic group that invaded Egypt prior to the events that followed in Exodus. And that Semitic group, the Hyksos, they were on the throne briefly, the Hyksos kings. And so they were foreigners who were essentially controlling Egypt, and they were the ones who were favorable. And this was likely the Pharaoh who was ruling at the time of Joseph. They were the ones who were favorable to the Jews, and so to the Hebrew people at that time. And so later on, when the Hyksos kings were overthrown, anybody who was seen as being allied with them or having favor, especially any foreigners, there was a backlash against any foreigners who were in Egypt. And even though by this point during the time of Moses, they were, hundreds of years had passed, and they were already well ingrained in society, they were seen as outsiders because they kept their own traditions. They lived in their own section of Egypt. They didn't worship the gods of the Egyptians. And so it was easy to scapegoat them, to see them as a threat, especially because the pharaohs wanted to conquer other lands. And so it was easy to say, these could be a potential ally of our enemies. They could join the other side. And look how many people, look how they outnumber us practically now. And so there was this great fear. And it was, we can't really say whether it was a reasonable fear or not. If they were treated well, they likely wouldn't have joined their enemies. But this was the propaganda that was being used, and it was really a foreshadowing also of things that would happen to the Jewish people much later on, hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, and especially during the time of the Holocaust. And even yet future times, we'll see this type of persecution of the Jews as well as Christians in the future. And so we see that Moses wasn't just a great man, but he was also one of humble beginnings as a slave. We saw and we know that the people of Israel at that time were treated and forced into slavery. They were oppressed in many different ways, but the most obvious ones were they were forced to build these cities, storage cities, these complexes. Not the pyramids. It's not recorded in the Bible or history that they built the pyramids. That was actually a voluntary force who was paid in provisions, but they were forced to build these storage cities for Pharaoh. Likely, it was that effort was in part to strengthen Egypt in order so that they could make war with surrounding nations. And so they were forced into slavery. So Moses was a great man, but he wasn't great because he had these noble upbringings, at least not by birth. By birth, he was a Hebrew, but he did become an elite and have an elite upbringing because of what happened later. We see in Exodus chapter 2, verse 10, it says there that when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So that's just a short reminder of Moses' story. The firstborn sons were ordered to be killed, and yet God made a provision, a way for him to survive and even to be brought into the household of the Pharaoh. And so the Pharaoh's daughter, one of the princesses, took Moses as her own son, um, and Moses found favor within that household, at least until the point of being brought up as kind of a noble, or at least having the education and the luxury of growing up in a royal household. But even though that was the case, even though Moses was brought up, unlike his fellow Hebrew slaves, even though he was treated to much better upbringing, we saw that he remained humble and meek. In Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, we're not going to read it just to save time. Time is quickly dwindling. But we see in Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, that Moses, this is him complaining to God when he's initially being sent to serve as ambassador to Pharaoh. He complains to God. He says, "Oh my Lord, I am not eloquent either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue." And then later in verse 11, at the end of it, he says, but he said, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." And so we see that his complaint there to God partly might be because this is 40 years later after Moses flees into the wilderness, after he goes to Midian and spends time in the wilderness, and then finally after 40 years and now he's 80 years old. Remember when he killed the Egyptian, he was 40 years old, and then another 40 years passed before the burning bush incident in which God charges him to serve as his ambassador. And so Moses' complaint here, at least partly, is because he's saying he's not a good speaker, and that might have very well been the case. He might have had a speech impediment. He might have been a stutterer or stammerer. Maybe it just might have been as simple as he just he thought he didn't really have a good enough. Well, he had a good enough background. Certainly, he must have been educated in the king's court, in the Pharaoh's court. And probably had the tutors like no one else at that time period would have had outside of that court. But certainly he thought it was the case that he wasn't the right person to speak, to be sent before Pharaoh. But another reasoning could have been also the fact that it's been 40 years. He's an old man at that point. He didn't leave Egypt in good standing, right? He fled. He was basically on the run, and whatever bridges he had must have been burned when he killed an Egyptian and lived a life basically as an outlaw outside of Egypt. And so he was removed also from any of the kind of circumstances going on. He wasn't up to date with anything. They didn't have any reliable way of spreading news at that time. And so whatever he heard of things going on in Egypt must have been secondhand. And it wasn't like he could just look it up on the internet or, watch the news and see what was going on. So he might have felt that he was really the wrong person to go back there. And that it would have been awkward, to say the least, him, a murderer, someone who was from Egypt, and from the Pharaoh's household, but was someone who was on the run, someone who was a lawbreaker. And so that might have factored into it. But his primary complaint to God was one of not being eloquent. And so, that might have also been a fair appraisal. We don't know, but he certainly didn't see himself as someone who was well gifted in speech, or someone who was very prideful and saying, "Oh, I could easily give a speech before the Pharaoh." And so he didn't view himself in that way. And also we know from Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, another instance that indicates his humility, his meekness. It says there, now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. So that's a very direct indication. I mean, you don't get any clearer than that. And it's a very remarkable statement to say that. Obviously, Jesus was the meekest person who ever lived. There's no way to compete with that. But to be the meekest person on the face of the earth, even just for a time period, that is high praise, and shows really that, and it might be because, as well as in spite of Moses's upbringing. He was a slave, but he was also brought up as an elite. But really, he might not have, because he was sandwiched between those two extremes, he might not have felt like he belonged to either. And so he really must not have seen himself as being accepted in Egyptian society, at least not fully. Otherwise, he might have been content with the luxury and the riches and the status of being in the Pharaoh's household. And he wasn't accepted by his fellow peers either. When he intervened and killed an Egyptian, and he tried to stop a conflict later on between two of his fellow Hebrews. They said, "What are you going to do? You're going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian?" And so you get the sense that the way God led him to that point, that he God's every step of the way, God had a plan for Moses, and his upbringing, sandwiched or in between those two worlds, really kind of made him the perfect person to send back to Egypt, because he both had an understanding of that system, of the Pharaoh, of the court, but also he didn't really belong to it. He was of it, but he wasn't really belonging to it. He was someone who really didn't belong in either world, and that was kind of probably the source of many of his frustrations and character flaws. And so what we see, the other thing that we note about Moses was that he was an angry man. Even though he had many positive attributes about him, and God wanted to use him, and he was the meekest person on the earth at that time, he was an angry man. We see in verse 8 of Exodus 11 that it says there, and all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, get out, and you and all the people who follow you. And after that, I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot or great anger, it says in the other version. And so this isn't an isolated incident. We see that Moses really never could let go of his anger, and it was a constant character flaw with him. He never found a way to manage his anger or to deal with it. And in some sense, anger can be a good thing. There is such thing as righteous indignation. But the issue with Moses was he let it come to the front when God wanted him to be more neutral. Anger on behalf of God can be good if it's righteous indignation, because even God has righteous indignation. But oftentimes Moses expressed his anger in when he shouldn't have, when he was called to do something specific. And we see from the fact that he was a murderer at this point, as well as the fact later on, the incident at Meribah, the word itself means quarreling, when he struck the rock when he wasn't supposed to in order to bring water forth from it. There was a time within this book itself that he did that and didn't strike the rock and water came forth. He was supposed to do the same thing, but at Meribah, he struck the rock in anger because he was so fed up with his people. You can see why he was, but at the same time, it wasn't his position to be anything but a leader, to be an ambassador for God, a leader of his people, and he never got a handle on his anger, and it was really something that plagued him. And so that was one character flaw of Moses, but it didn't stop him from being used by God, as we'll see. So next we'll look at the other person in this feud, in this confrontation, and that's the Pharaoh. And what we know about the Pharaoh is, firstly, all pharaohs were considered to be god kings, much like Japanese or Chinese emperors of various periods of time. I think even today, the emperor is considered of Japan considered, even though it's a figurehead position, he's considered a god. And the Pharaoh was considered, considered to be a god. The Pharaoh of this time period, of the one that Moses encounters, we believe him to be Ramses II. We don't know this as definitive, but it's from a lot of evidence we consider it to be Ramses II. And that name itself means Ra or Re. Some historians will often spell or pronounce Ra as Re, R-E versus R-A, same God. And Ramses II means Ra or Re is the one who bore him. And there's a lot of names that's especially for pharaohs that would begin that way. It's the same way Muslims, have Allah in their names, Abdullah. It's there's a lot. It's the same kind of derivation where you're attributing it to a god. And so in the same way, Ramses, that Ra in the name indicates that it's in attribution or related to Ra, and so Ra is the one who bore him. So Ramses the second, his name literally means he's a son of Ra, the sun god, right? And so this is how the people viewed Pharaoh as a god king, as a human who was the son of their god. You can see how this is in direct conflict to our God. Other things to note about this Pharaoh is Ramses II was the most powerful Pharaoh militarily of golden age of, or one of the golden ages of Egypt. And this was also the most powerful period of Egypt's history as well, the New Kingdom. And so he was well known throughout the ancient world, and even today, historians study him because of battles and conquests that he did where he was successful, and including the Battle of Kadesh, where 6,000 chariots were involved between the Syrians and the Hittites as well as the Egyptians. And so many areas were being conquered by Pharaoh. And so you could see why the Egyptians would go along with this idea that he was a god king when the times were good. And this Pharaoh, he was really seen as a god by his people. And so that's why that final plague was a judgment against the god king himself by killing his own son. In a way, his son would be seen as a god himself, because he was to be the successor, the firstborn son. And so that was a judgment against them. So the Pharaoh was seen as a god. He was also, from what we see here in chapter 11, as well as elsewhere, the prior chapters, we see that he was a stubborn man, a very stubborn man. We see continuously the fact that it says that he hardened his heart, and he refused, even after each one of these plagues. It's destroying the nation of Egypt. It's destroying his people. Each one of these plagues occurs, and he kind of says, "Oh, I'll let your people go." But then he says, "No, forget it. I'm not letting your people go." And after all these devastating plagues, he still refuses. He hardens his heart even further. He completely refuses to give in. And really, the lesson that we see from Pharaoh is that humanity has this problem. Humanity has this stubbornness of heart. We see it throughout the Bible with leaders like Nebuchadnezzar. This arrogance and this stubbornness. It really takes a great deal of judgment for God to bring about change, and it never occurs with Pharaoh, but it occurred with Nebuchadnezzar. We saw that Nebuchadnezzar was judged multiple times, and finally the final one is the where he is driven mad essentially, and eats grass of the earth for years, and finally he comes to his senses and gives glory to God. And he does that as like one of the few examples of repentant world leaders in history. But history is riddled with these leaders who are the height of human arrogance. They're really the epitome of human arrogance and domination of other people and subjugation of other people. And by judging Pharaoh, God is really judging the world. We also see that the Pharaoh is a foreshadowing of the Antichrist. In Exodus, this chapter, Exodus chapter 11, verse 5, we see that it says there that the firstborn will be judged, not just the firstborn of the Pharaoh's household, but every firstborn son in the entire nation, including the cattle. And so this is a judgment. It's a selective judgment, and showing that, and also it shows that God is selectively judging Egypt, because not a single one of the firstborn would be killed of the people of the Hebrews. They would, we know from the Passover story that they were spared, and they would have to put blood over the lintel in order to preserve them. And what this is really showing is, in the same way in the future, God selectively judges or will selectively judge the world. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 40 through 42, you can look at that at a later time. It says there, "Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on which day your Lord is coming." A lot of times that gets misinterpreted. People think it's, sometimes think it's talking about the rapture, but it's not. It's the prior verses talking about Noah. The comparison to Noah, the time of Noah, clearly shows that it's talking about judgment. And this also harkens back to this chapter, where we see that God will often judge selectively the world and spare his own people. And this is really showing his power of judging the world and increasing this judgment. And the other thing we see in this story is in Exodus 11 is really, this is the height of human arrogance, but it also shows the limit of human power and knowledge. We see that the Pharaoh calls his scientists, his magicians. Today we might call them scientists, because at that time magic and actual knowledge went hand in hand. The healers of that time, the magicians, the astrologers, they all had some real knowledge, but it was all always mixed in with a lot of fabrication and worshiping of their gods and sacrifices and all those things. Same way that alchemy later on became actual chemistry. That's the same way. There was some actual knowledge. And so you can draw the parallel between that time and in the future. I'm sure in the future, when the tribulation period is going on, God is increasing these judgments against the world, and the Antichrist will be stubbornly entrenched, just like the Pharaoh was. And he'll call together his experts and scientists, and they'll be able to explain away some of these things and to replicate some of these things. But in the same fashion, God will eventually show that his power is supreme, and that humanity doesn't have the knowledge or the power to replicate even a fraction of what he can. And in the same way, the magicians, they, at a certain point during the plagues, they gave up and said, no, we can't mimic this anymore. They could mimic things like, turning a small amount of water red, or turning a staff into a snake, but they couldn't replicate the massive scale or the power that God could. And so what we see from this encounter between Moses and Pharaoh, there's this stark contrast between these two figures. They have a common point that they both grew up in the royal household, but this stark contrast. And yet what we see in both examples, both positive and negative, is we see that God is really the one in control. We see that with the push and the pull of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, we see firstly, it says, that God, that the Pharaoh hardened his heart, but then it says God hardened his heart. God, says on multiple times that he hardens the heart of Pharaoh, but Pharaoh also hardens his own heart, this push and pull. But ultimately, God is the one who's control. We also saw that God, even in his choosing of Moses from the burning bush onwards, God was leading Moses and preparing him for his role. Even though Moses didn't see himself as the perfect person for the job, God saw him as perfect for the job, not because he was specially talented or an eloquent speaker, but because God would be the one who was glorified through this. We see in verses 6 and 7, at the end of that, it says, that you may know the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. It's the Lord who's distinguishing between and making judgment between Egypt and Israel. In verses 9 and 10, it says there, that Pharaoh will not listen to you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. That's ultimately what's on display here. It's not the might of man. It is not the eloquence of man. It is the might of God and his wonders. And that's why throughout history, he has demonstrated it through miracles and judgments. And he will again display that in the end times, which are not far away. We're actually living in the end times, but that final period is yet to come, and it will come soon. And so ultimately, the conclusion that we can draw from all these passages is God is the one, from this passage and from other passages we looked at, is that God is the one who is in control of human events and history. That one day we might be called before leaders like Moses was called before Pharaoh. And what we see is that, ultimately Moses had nothing to fear, because we see in Exodus chapter 12, verses 29 through 32, that ultimately God judges the Pharaoh by taking away the thing most precious to him. And the greatest symbol of the gods in Egypt was by taking away his firstborn son. And the cry that went out through Egypt at that time, from the royal household down to the lowest servant of the Egyptians. And so God's power is on display. God's right to take human life is on display. And we see finally the fate of Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 14, verses 15 through 18, and verses 26 through 29. We can't read it. My time's already up, more than up, but I just want to draw those to a close. It's hard to underestimate, the power of the ancient world, because, we are comparing it to modern times, but an army that was likely in 100,000 strong, chasing millions, the millions of people who were leaving Egypt at that time. And God took the Red Sea and used it to destroy this massive army, the greatest army that existed on the planet at that time in the ancient world. And so we see God judged the Nile, the very source of life that the Egyptians counted on, the source of their power. He judged that, and he used the Red Sea to judge them in this final stroke of destruction of this Pharaoh. In the same way, we'll see in the end times when the Antichrist, he's judged at the Battle of Armageddon, which is not coincidentally also a battle, a historical battle. The Battle of Megiddo would take place later on, past this time of the Pharaoh. Later on, that first battle would occur at the Battle of Megiddo. And we see that the Antichrist will be judged, and he will be thrown into a lake of fire, much like this Pharaoh was thrown into this lake, into this great lake, into the Red Sea. And so this is history repeats itself. But what our lesson, personally to take away from this is that we have to be ready to stand before leaders. Just like it says in Luke chapter 12, we see, when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and authorities, do not be anxious about how you shall defend yourself or what you should say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to say. Moses was afraid that he wasn't a good speaker, but it's not about your words, it's not about how you say your words. It's not about how eloquent you are. At the right time, God will give you the words, and even though the words might not sound eloquent, that's a lot of times people are worried about that, but that's pretentious. That's worried about what people think, their impression of you. And what really matters is God is the one using those words and delivering those words by his Spirit to the hearer, and he's the one who's going to make an impact on the mind or the heart. And so that's what we need to be prepared for, to be prepared to speak before rulers and authorities, or even less than that. We shouldn't be afraid, no matter who we're speaking before. If we can be called to speak before rulers and leaders, we should be prepared to speak before our neighbors and be to our coworkers, and to proclaim them to our classmates, to proclaim to them that judgment is coming, much like it came upon Pharaoh and Egypt, and it's going to come soon upon this world that is collapsing and decaying. And lastly, we see the enduring example of Moses in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through 26. it says there at the end of that Moses chose, rather than to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, chose rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By that same token, may we be willing to be mistreated in this world for the sake of the gospel and for a greater reward that awaits us in heaven. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that you've given us to study your word, to learn from the examples of Moses and Pharaoh. Let us learn from the negative examples, both from the shortcomings of Moses, but also the arrogance of Pharaoh, and not follow that. But also, Lord, on the positive side, let us remember to be bold and to not give value to the things of this world, but to value the rewards in heaven, O Lord. And let us boldly proclaim that judgment is coming upon this world, but you, O Lord, have paradise waiting for those who are called.